A beheading and murders in a church in Nice, France, and Ted Cruz berating the head of Twitter for censoring the New York Post. What do they have in common? I'll tell you what they have in common. They both involve denial of freedom of speech. And you're going to hear about that on the Dershow. Today on the Dershow, we're going to talk about two apparently unrelated subjects that are, in fact, closely related. You will be surprised. The first is this horrible beheading and murder in a church in Nice, in France, by an Islamic extremist who is yelling that God is great in Arabic. All right, that is one issue. But the second issue I'm going to talk about is Google and Twitter and Facebook and the hearings in front of Congress. And what do they have to do with each other? A killing in Nice by an Islamic terrorist and testimony by three high-tech entrepreneurs. They have everything to do with each other. What they're united by is free speech and censorship. The terrorism in France was the result of French journalists, a French teacher, and others publishing, exercising their freedom of expression to publish cartoons and pictures and likenesses of the Prophet Muhammad, which is deeply offensive to many Muslims. And so the response in France by these extremists, and particularly by this one person, was to kill. As somebody once said, the ultimate form of censorship, killing the person who speaks. The response of Twitter and Facebook is fortunately not to kill, just to censor, not to allow the New York Post story to be seen by the followers of Twitter. And we'll talk about how they relate to each other and how they both represent a culture of intolerance and a culture of we know better and a culture of we're not going to let you express views that we fundamentally disagree with and that we find deeply offensive. Let's start with this morning's terrible news about the mass murder in Nice, France. It is not an isolated incident, not even an isolated incident of terrorism. It's part of a pattern. We know the pattern. It didn't begin with, but the most prominent early manifestation of it was the killing of journalists and cartoonists and writers at a French magazine for daring to publish cartoons of the Prophet. After that happened, the Yale Press, a book was written about it, but the Yale Press refused to publish the cartoons for fear that students at Yale would be killed if they published the cartoons. They were terrified. And so the book was written about cartoons without the readers being able to view the cartoons and judge for themselves. Then you all remember just a short time ago, a school teacher was teaching about that case. And in order to teach students about the values of free speech, he apparently showed them some of the cartoons. And a father of one of the students became enraged and called for retaliation. And of course, the teacher was beheaded. And then we had this terrible, terrible event this morning. Who's to blame? The people themselves, of course, are the primary villains, but they were incited by some, you can't generalize, but some extremist Islamic leaders are prepared to justify killing as an appropriate response to insult. It was the dictator of Turkey who recently called for retaliation against France, against the French people for insulting Islam and insulting him. Did today's killer listen to Erdogan? I don't know. Was Erdogan's statement of retaliation, calling it like the Crusades? Crusades, of course, involved killing on both parts. Was it part of the atmospheric that led this man to believe that he was doing the right thing and that he would be rewarded, if not in this world, in the world to come. Certainly, Erdogan contributed to an atmosphere of intolerance, an atmosphere in which hurling an insult deserves death. I think it was Sigmund Freud many years ago who said, civilization began on the day that the first human being hurled an insult instead of a spear. An insult instead of a spear. That was the beginning of civilization, according to Freud. To paraphrase it, turn it on its head, civilization will end when we accept the throwing of spears as an acceptable response to the hurling of an insult or the drawing of an insult. And so we have to be very, very, very tough on those who claim that because they're offended or insulted, they have the right to do whatever is necessary to restore the dignity of the Prophet. And believe me, Turkey is not alone, and what happened in France, again, is not isolated. Look at what goes on throughout the Middle East. You have Palestinian leaders of Hamas, of the Palestinian Authority, and of Hezbollah calling for retaliation, calling for violence if, quote, a dirty Jew sets foot on the mountaintop where the Holy Temple of Judaism, Solomon's Temple, was built, and where the Al-Aqsa and other mosques exists today, a place holy to both Judaism and Islam. And you have some Palestinian leaders calling for a violent response if any Jew dares to pray. And then you get American universities that glorify killing in the name of retaliation. You get San Francisco State University inviting Leila Khalid, a Palestinian terrorist who threatened to blow up an airplane with a lot of Americans and other people on it, in retaliation against Israel. We have, and they invited her to speak, and basically we're honoring her. Or you have other people like Linda Sarsour, who is today a very important part of hard left feminism, who has justified terrorism. Or the Palestinian Authority, which has a pay to slay policy in which people are given money in response to killing Jews. You kill a Jew, you get a bounty, you get money in response. I mean, if that doesn't incentivize killing, I don't know what does. And moving away from the Middle East, we all remember when abortion doctors in this country, several of them, were murdered and injured just because they provided an abortion service permissible under the Constitution. But radical right-to-lifers decided it was perfectly appropriate to employ violence to prevent what they call the genocide of the unborn. So you get religious justifications for violence throughout the world, and it has to stop. How do you stop it? How do you stop it consistent with freedom of speech? It's not easy if you don't have a First Amendment, the way France and Britain don't quite have First Amendments. They can close down mosques, and they can deport preachers who preach violence. It'd be much harder to do that in the United States. In the United States, advocacy of violence is protected by the Constitution. Incitement to violence is not. What's the difference? It's not a sharp line. Advocacy means, I think it's a good idea, if the time comes, when it's right to overthrow the government by force or violence. I think it's a good idea if somebody insults your prophet, perhaps to kill that person. That's advocacy, protected by the Constitution. Incitement is directly speaking to the person you want to do something and saying, kill, kill, kill now. The leading case on that in Britain was a case, the last capital punishment case in Britain, but a very interesting case where a mentally retarded or at least mentally challenged young man was holding a gun and threatening to kill a police officer. And the police officer was saying, no, don't kill me. Give me the gun. Give me the gun. And somebody standing next to the man with the gun yelled out in a very loud voice, Give it to him! Give it to him! The mentally retarded man misunderstood, or maybe understood properly, we don't know, but misunderstood the statement as give it to him, shoot him, kill him. And he did. He shot and killed the police officer. The defendant, who was then charged with inciting murder, said, no, I meant give him the gun. And so that became a leading case in England. But the law is clear in the United States today that if somebody has a gun and is about to shoot somebody and you tell him to do it and you encourage him to do it and you incite him to do it, you can be guilty, notwithstanding the First Amendment. But the line between advocacy and incitement is very hard to draw, particularly when it comes to an imam or a rabbi or a minister preaching violence. Remember, there were rabbis who called for the assassination of Rabin. We're now celebrating the anniversary of Rabin's tragic assassination, and Israel put on trial at least one rabbi for inciting the killing of Rabin, citing biblical sources, etc. Would that satisfy the First Amendment in the United States? I don't know. I myself have been subject to threats of violence. I brought a lawsuit against Cardinal Glemp, the cardinal of the Polish Church in Warsaw. And when I brought that lawsuit, a Polish patriot, very religious man, came up to Cambridge, where I lived, with a baseball bat and threatened to bash in my head. Fortunately, I found out about it, called the police, and he was arrested. I was then threatened by a former prisoner who was a neo-Nazi, and he threatened to kill me because I refused to defend him. Long story about why I refused to defend him, not because of his views, but because I said I would charge him a fee and contribute it to the Anti-Defamation League and the NAACP and gay rights organizations, and he wouldn't do it, so I wouldn't defend him. But he threatened to kill me. And I've had threats on college campuses to kill me. When I went up to the University of Toronto a few years ago to speak, I needed armed guards on the stage with me, sitting behind glass bulletproof protectors to keep threats of violence, because I was going to be making the case for Israel, actually the case for the two-state solution, but one of the states was the nation state of the Jewish people. So I needed protection, threats against my life. And so what we have then is incitement today on college campuses against Israel. Just to switch for 1 second, a recent poll just came out today showed that among Democrats, Israel is less favored than Cuba. Among Republicans, of course, Israel has a very high standing, but among Democrats, all Democrats, not just young Democrats, all Democrats, according to this poll, Israel is at 36% popularity, one of the least popular countries. Cuba is at 39%. Cuba, a repressive dictatorship that imprisons gays, that prevents all free speech, that for many years exported terrorism, probably doesn't do it anymore, but an enemy of America for many, many, many years, among Democrats is more popular than Israel, America's greatest ally, a country that has contributed enormously to humanity in just 72 years of its existence, and a country that has a better record on human rights than any comparable country in the world facing comparable threats. But when you go on university campuses, you hear so much propaganda against Israel and incitement against Israel that students on campuses today really are threatened, are physically intimidated and threatened. And I just dread the first case that we may have someday on a college campus in the United States where somebody who was incited against Israel physically attacks a Jewish student who was supporting Israel. A development in England along those lines is relevant to our discussion today. Today, Jeremy Corbyn was suspended from the Labour Party. He lost his vote in the Parliament because a commission report ruled that when he was the head of the Labour Party was rampant with anti-Semitism, and Corbyn facilitated it. Okay, why is that relevant to America? Let me tell you why it's relevant to America. Who was Jeremy Corbyn's biggest supporter in America? Bernie Sanders, the first Jew ever to prominently run for president. So here you have the only real American supporter of Jeremy Corbyn. He went over to England and campaigned for him, campaigned for an anti-Semite. What's wrong with this picture? What is going on here? Why does Bernie Sanders support an anti-Semite or support a supporter of anti-Semites like Jeremy Corbyn? You might ask a similar, not the same question. I don't want to compare Bernie Sanders to my former colleague and friend, Elizabeth Warren. But Elizabeth Warren recently made a statement urging Democrats in New York to vote for the Biden-Harris ticket, but not to vote for them on the Democrat line. Not to vote for them on the line in which the elector among them would be Hillary Clinton. Instead, what Elizabeth Warren asked Democrats to do in New York, along with Bernie Sanders, is to vote for that ticket on the Family Working Party. What's it called? The Working Family Party. What is the Working Family Party? I have an article in front of me right here from Front Page Magazine. The Working Families Party has an anti-Semitism problem, says the article, and the article goes through and documents many instances where the Working Families Party is just like the British Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn. In fact, the Working Families Party could be Jeremy Corbyn's party. So why do we have Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders asking people to support that party, which has been in bed with anti-Semites and which has incited acts of bigotry against the Jewish people? The collective impact of what's going on campuses today, what's going on within elements of the Democratic Party, is that Jews are being silenced. People who support Israel are being silenced. We're not being beheaded, thankfully. We're not being attacked. We're not losing our jobs. But the ability to speak up under the First Amendment on college campuses on behalf of Israel, on behalf of the two-state solution, is being threatened. Is being threatened by intimidation, by, in some instances, physical violence, in other instances, peer review. It's a dangerous phenomenon, and it certainly impacts on the spirit, if not the letter, of the First Amendment. So let's now move to the other issue that seems unrelated, but in some direct way is related to what's going on around the world in terms of suppression of controversial and offensive speech.
So Twitter takes the view you can censor the New York Post, you can censor Politico, presumably you can censor the New York Times or any other media outlet. Mr. Dorsey, who the hell elected you and put you in charge of what the media are allowed to report and what the American people are allowed to hear? And why do you persist in behaving as a Democratic super PAC, silencing views to the contrary of your political beliefs?
Let's give Mr. Dorsey a few seconds to answer that, and then we'll have to conclude this segment.
Well, we're not doing that, and this is why I opened this hearing with calls for more transparency. We realize we need to earn trust more. We realize that more accountability is needed to show our intentions and to show the outcomes.
Thank you, Senator.
So I hear the concerns and acknowledge them, but we want to fix it with more transparency.
Well, that was my former student, Ted Cruz, Senator Ted Cruz, really giving a hard time to the head of Twitter. He may have overstated it when he talked about it as a super PAC for the Democratic Party, but they really have a problem. And I think the problem was well illustrated during the colloquy between Cruz and the head of Twitter, when Cruz very pointedly asked him how he could justify censoring the New York Post when they had stories about the Hunter Biden alleged laptop, but not censoring the New York Times when it essentially published Donald Trump's tax returns, which could not have been properly given to it. There's no way I can think of that anybody who had lawful possession of President Trump's tax returns would have the right to turn them over to the media. The only people who would have those returns are his lawyer, his accountant, both of whom would have obligations not to disclose it to newspapers, obligations of confidentiality, both by law and by professional ethics, or somebody who worked for the IRS, who is obligated by law not to disclose tax returns. And yet the New York Times published it, and Twitter allowed it to be all over Twitter. But they didn't allow, initially, they now claim they've changed their views and will now allow the New York Post to tweet about the Hunter Biden laptop. Again, this is not about whether you should vote for Biden or you should vote for Trump. That's not the subject of the Dershow. The subject of the Dershow is who gets to tell you what you can read, who gets to tell you what you can see, who gets to tell you what cartoons you can draw, who gets to tell you what tweets you can send out, or in the elegant words of my former student, who the hell elected Twitter or Facebook or Google or anybody else to determine what gets seen and heard on these incredibly powerful platforms, which are immunized from liability by statute because they're supposed to be platforms. As I've said before on the Dershow, if they censor nothing, that's fine. Then they give no imprimatur to anything they publish. It's like a taxi cab. First guy who hails the cab gets in the cab. If you have the fare, he has to take you wherever you want to go. He can't ask you whether you're going to vote Republican or Democrat. But once a platform decides to censor certain things, it then sends a message about the things it didn't censor. Oh, gee, we think this passes muster. This satisfies our standards. This is either truthful or obtained legally. And once they do that, they're telling the American public what the American public is entitled to decide for themselves. What's truth, what's not truth, what's permissible, what's impermissible. Law enforcement is entitled to decide that. Not up to the media to make those decisions. And so the First Amendment is under pressure. And freedom of speech, even in areas where there's no First Amendment, is under pressure. I'm not an absolutist. I understand there have to be some limitations on free speech. I've never bought the notion about shouting fire in a crowded theater. That's not speech at all. Someday we'll have a discussion about that. That's like setting off an alarm bell. You can't set off an alarm bell falsely. That's a crime. And you can't yell fire falsely because that's an alarm bell and that's a crime. But the analogies don't generally take us where the people using the analogies want to take us. But there are restrictions on free speech. You can't threaten people. You can't extort them. You can't conspire with another using free speech. You can't defame maliciously. There are limits. But the cases we're talking about today don't even come close to the limits. Drawing a cartoon, showing a cartoon to students to teach them about freedom of speech, advocating abortion, speaking up on behalf of Israel. These are clearly constitutionally and morally protected rights. The same thing is true with reporting on the Hunter Biden laptop, reporting on the New York Times disclosure of tax returns. Those are all forms of protected speech, and we have to stand up for them. And on the Dershow, you're going to hear constantly my defense of free speech, not only for me, but for thee. Not only for me and thee, but for people who I abhor. I am a member of the First Amendment Club. To be a member of the First Amendment Club, you have to be willing to stand up for speech you abhor, speech that hurts you to the core of your being. If you're Jewish, you got to stand up for the ability of somebody to deny the Holocaust. If you're black, you have to stand up for the right of somebody to be a white supremacist. If you're a woman, you have to stand up and defend somebody who wants to have sexist speech. That's what joining the First Amendment Club means. And it means if you're a Muslim, you have to stand up and defend the right of people to draw cartoons that are offensive to you that depict the prophet. So you've heard my view on the Dershow. Now I want to hear yours. So this is the Dershow, and of course the Dershow is based on my name, Dershowitz, but there's no wits in the Dershow. That's why we have callers You provide the wits. So, our first caller, what do you have to say?
I just can't believe that anybody with a brain in their head could possibly vote for Joe Biden. He is a moron. He's a liar. He's a scandalous piece of dirt.
A lot of people are going to vote for Joe Biden. I can predict here today he will win the popular vote. I don't think that's much in dispute. Whether he wins the electoral vote depends on so many contingencies and circumstances, but millions of Americans will disagree with you and will regard Joe Biden as a decent man, an intelligent man, a thoughtful man, and a man who will be good for America. Millions of people will vote for Donald Trump. They will regard him as a decent man who has done good things in foreign policy. Some will vote for him though they disagree with him. Some will vote for Biden so they disagree with him. That's America, but name calling, I don't think we need that. So Alfred from Virginia, what's your point?
Lifetime Democrat, two-time Biden, Obama-Biden voter. However, I switched and voted for Trump last time around, and this is not so much that for Trump, but against Hillary. And the Democrats are so corrupt, and they've got the media, with the exception of a few outlets, and they've got big tech. They've got the, hate to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but they do have the deep state. They have the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, and here's the conclusion. We will have the ability for one political party to use the big media like the Soviet Union used Pravda. And people are not getting the true story. It's obvious that Biden was crooked, and it is kind of scary. Thank you.
But the difference between here and Pravda, here in the Soviet Union, is in a few days, people get to vote. They may have incomplete information on both sides, but they get to vote, and they get to determine who their next president is going to be. And we all hope that whoever is elected, if there is a transition, it will be a peaceful transition. Again, this show is not about who you're voting for. This show is about how to get to the truth, how to protect liberty, how to protect freedom. Of course, who you vote for may determine and may lead to different approaches to liberty and free speech. So again, please just vote, vote, vote. Vote in person if you can, vote by mail if you can't, vote early. Don't count on your vote being counted if it comes in late. Make sure your vote comes in well before Election Day, which means get your vote out today if you can, because it's getting late. We're almost there. Thanks for your call. The next call is from Isaac.
And my question is with respect to Carlson's interview of Tony Bobolinsky, isn't the drama of what Bobolinsky revealed as backed up by emails significantly undercut by the fact that it goes to what happened and what Biden was doing when he was out of office? None of it seems to go to what Biden did when he was in office. And out of office, I presume he could lawfully raise money, earn money any way he chose. That's my question. I'm interested in your thought on that. Thank you. Goodbye.
It's a very, very good point. There is an enormous difference, of course, between a sitting vice president and a private citizen. There's also an enormous difference between a private citizen and a candidate for president of the United States. If you're running for president, people are going to do favors for you and your children in anticipation of you becoming president of the United States. And perhaps there should be tighter rules on what people can do once they've decided or announced that they're going to run for president. But I completely agree with you. I think that if he were purely a private citizen, for example, the Clintons today or the Obamas today, they're entitled to make money as long as they do it lawfully and as long as they do it in a way that doesn't in any way use the office they once had. These are all gray areas, but the distinction you make is an important one. Alan, what's your question?
You've revealed who you voted for in 2016, Hillary Clinton. My first question is, why are you not revealing who you are going to vote for? this year? And my second question is, will you be revealing who you did vote for after the election has been decided? Thank you very much.
It's a good question. I generally don't reveal who I voted for. I reveal that I voted for Hillary Clinton largely because people criticized me so much for having defended the president. I wanted to make the point that I've defended Bill Clinton, I defended Al Gore, I defended Alan Cranston. I wasn't defending President Trump because I voted for him. So I had to make that point. Other than that, I think votes are private.
I'm an ex-Democrat. I voted for Trump in 2016, and I'm going to vote red all the way across because I believe in our democracy, and the mainstream media is so criminal that it should offend everybody, especially the connections to the Chinese Communist Party. It just seems that the Republicans are the only people interested in our civil liberties. And I'm not radical. I mean, I supported Roe v. Wade because I thought abortion should be rare, safe, and legal. However, the modern technology and the atrocities that could be committed with this technology really should be morally evaluated. And having it go back to the states is not an evil. It's not evil. I mean, that's what a democracy is all about. I mean, our Supreme Court is not supposed to legislate. So it's just too far left for me. What the tech tyrants did to the New York Post story is something that I would think would happen in communist China. And from what I understand, they hired 12 experts from communist China to censor us. And the New York Post cannot sue? I mean, that's outrageous. It's terrible what's going on. Personally, I think Donald Trump is the only man keeping us from a horrific global order.
I appreciate your point. On Roe versus Wade, I'd be interested if we had a dialogue, what you would think of the national legislature if Congress passed a national right to choose law saying that a woman has the right to choose abortion up to a certain point in every state, so that we have uniformity, so we don't have young women having to travel many miles from one state to another to get a safe and reasonably inexpensive abortion. I suspect we may get such a law passed soon. One point I wanted to make about your call, because every call today has been a call from people who are Republicans now voting for Trump, many of them former Democrats. I would very much like to expand my audience on the Dershow. I'm very happy to have all of you calling in who are voting for Trump, who are Republicans, but I'd like some callers who are Democrats, who are voting or have voted for Biden. I'd like to have a more diversified listener and viewer base so we can have points of view from all sides expressed. It could be that we do have that as a listener base, but that the folks who are calling in represent only one part of that base. So please, if you're out there, no matter what your political views are, no matter who you're voting for, call the Dershow. I want to hear your point of view. Provide me with the wits. And thanks for your call. Freedom of speech may be in danger in France. It may be in danger in parts of the Muslim world. It may be in danger even on the Twitter world. But the one place you're always going to get freedom of speech is on the Dershow. So please keep listening, keep watching, and keep calling. Please call 24/7. The number is 216-710-0050. Keep your comments short and to the point. Again, the number for you to call 24/7 is 216-710-0050.